Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Half Pint Sessions. Now, normally my glass will be filled with beer, but today I am speaking to somebody who is in England, and so therefore it's very early here in La Crosse, Wisconsin. So I thought I probably shouldn't be starting the alcohol just yet. So I have my water, I have a cup of tea brewing, and today I'm speaking to a fantastically bearded gentleman who also has a beautiful accent, Nate Morgan Locke. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much for having me, David. It's nice to be here.
As I said to you when we first started talking today, I normally don't speak to people with such beautiful accents. I normally have to talk to Americans the entire time.
Yes, it's a cross. We bear it. But well done, brother. Go on. Persevere.
Thank you.
You'll be fine.
Now, would you mind just introducing yourself to our viewers and listeners? Who are you? What do you do?
Oh, sure. So my name's Nathan James Hamden Morgan Locke, or Nate, if that's easier for you to remember. I work for Speak Life, which is an evangelistic ministry based in Eastbourne, a little seaside town on the south coast of England. I live here with my wife and two children. And I grew up in Narnia, literally. Hopefully that provokes some questions as to what that might mean.
Well, tell us about that. How did you grow up in Narnia, and what was your relationship with Lewis?
So my parents' house is called Narnia. So I am, the son of Narnians, and am therefore a Narnian myself. You can find that house just off the M6 near Stoke-on-Trent if you're ever in the North Midlands of England. And yeah, as I say, growing up in a Christian family that took literature seriously, that took the imagination seriously, that took the mind seriously, and so we grew up aware of the work of Lewis. I think they're probably the books I knew best as a child. For me, I think Care Paravel was as real a place as Milton Keynes. Probably more real because no one ever talked to me about Milton Keynes or Wisconsin. I mean, that's a made up place, surely.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the Stone Table, the Lantern Waste. I mean, all of these were just very kind of real places in my imagination. And I suppose Lewis talks about the baptism of his imagination from George MacDonald in Surprised by Joy. And I suppose my imagination was baptized by Lewis, by rock opera god Meatloaf, interestingly enough.
Oh,
I
I'm
was
with
very
you.
much into those Bat Out of Hell albums. And I suppose the third thing was it was probably, so I think about my imagination and my entry into sort of the world of storytelling and that sort of thing. I remember Charles Wesley's "And Can It Be?" Whenever we do the long my imprisoned spirit lay, fast bound in sin and nature's night, thine eye diffused a quickening ray. I woke, the dungeon flamed with light. My chains fell off, my heart was free. I rose, went forth, and followed thee. So for me, these vivid images of salvation, of Christian faith, of engaging with ideas, using storytelling. Lewis was right there in the middle of those as I was kind of navigating my way around North Staffordshire in the 80s and 90s.
So, listening to Meatloaf.
Listening to Meatloaf. That's right.
I really now think that the Four Loves should end with "I would do anything for love, but I won't do
that." That is right. It is right. Yeah. In fact, I suppose just on a background point, it's interesting you mentioned the Four Loves. When I went off to university and had my heart broken for the first time, sort of unrequited love sort of thing. I remember my parents were going to a Christian conference, sort of, I think, Spring Harvest, if you sort of would know
I've
that name.
been, yeah.
So I was sort of gone along to that, and I was sort of sullenly, as a sort of university student who wasn't especially interested in a lot of the seminars and the offerings that were on there. My dad gave me a new copy of Four Loves and said, "Why don't you just sit in the chalet and read this?" So I suppose my Lewis relationship, not just childhood, but also into adulthood, of finding his work, just a part of my Christian journey, really, and my formation, and also my kind of ongoing Christian life.
Well, I think if we learned anything thus far in the interview, it's that you had very good parents, constantly keeping a steady stream of Lewis in your hands.
Yes. I mean, people talk about privilege all the time, don't they? But Lewis privilege. I mean, that's I think, possibly the biggest thing I should acknowledge. As I acknowledge my privileges, that's definitely it. Yeah.
Now, you first came on my radar when I saw your very provocatively titled video, "Narnia is a Terrible Franchise." Needless to say, that piqued my interest and I started watching. And I actually shared it on our Slack channel with our Patreon supporters a few days ago in anticipation of this
Shout out
interview.
to the Patreon supporters. Well done.
Keeping the lights on. And it was hilarious because you saw a lot of people initially see the title and I was like, rah! And then they started watching your video and then started concluding that maybe you had a bit of a point. So before we get our pitchforks and torches out, would you mind explaining to us, what is it you say in that video? Why is Narnia a terrible franchise?
Yeah. So the series, I was doing a series of videos on franchise storytelling and basically these big intellectual property things: Harry Potter, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Narnia, Toy Story. I was very passionate about Toy Story. And I'd sort of been orienting the whole series so that I could eventually talk about Narnia and why it doesn't work, and why actually I think that's a good thing, because there is something about a lot of those other franchises where they are so kind of in the grip of media corporations who simply exist to make more and more money, that you are a customer. Your engagement with this imaginary world is one that you're paying for, and that I think there's something refreshingly just something refreshing about the fact that Walden Media had all those films that they tried to make, and they just couldn't quite get it to work. So I think there's something that's great about Lewis's relationship with Pauline Baines as the illustrator, and he didn't really like her work, and he found it difficult. And those images, they are connected to the original releases, but that we don't have the brand Narnia in the same way as we certainly do with the Wizarding World of Harry Potter or Star Wars or all these other things, which kind of have the merchandising kind of which have the merchandise. You should tell the listener at least what you've just raised to your lips.
I've just been sipping on my Star Wars mug, which my good friend Joe Q sent me. It's got a little stormtrooper on the other side with a gun that says pew pew pew. Anyway, please continue. You're talking about merchandising and selling out.
Yeah, so and I think there's something really interesting about the way that certain stories or imaginary worlds can inspire us to create our own versions of them. Before I was aware that you could, really buy all the official merchandise of a football club close to Stoke-on-Trent called Port Vale FC, I used to go along, and a friend of my family had knitted me a scarf in the colours of Port Vale Football Club. And there was something that was so, sort of pathetic about that in a way, because, I could have gone to the club shop and bought, and paid money and got the official one, and apparently supported the club in that way. But I think when you're just contributing your dollars and your pounds to a franchise, there's so much more that you can do, and I think it's a shame when franchises become franchises in that way. And as I say, I think it's actually a good thing that Narnia is a terrible franchise.
So, in what way is it a terrible franchise? What
Okay.
is it about the books that make them a terrible franchise?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's the fact that they're jumping around with different characters and themes and motifs, which are, I mean, we could get into the, Michael Ward's Planet Narnia sort of theory, and this is the medieval solar system being, depicted in narrative form. But essentially, you don't have recognizable characters that are going to stay with you through the books
in
the way that you do for Harry Potter. It's going to move around, and Narnia itself, in some way, I mean, it's not a properly sort of fluid geography, right? There are things. This lamppost is here because it was planted, way back at the beginning of Narnia. But the fact that these things are forgotten, and then you don't go back to Lantern Waste, in many of the other books, so that Lewis is showing you something else each time, and that is not good if you're trying to make lots of money from selling merchandise. You want easily recognizable characters. You want costumes that you can sell for Halloween and for any other sort of costume party that you're going to go to. You want a lot of lunch boxes, and that's not what you're going to get. Even just the way that you write the words, the Chronicles of Narnia, that brand kind of badge, if you like, it's difficult. It's kind of difficult to maintain because you don't actually have it in the books themselves. You'd have to be forcing that on, and I think Walden Media gave it their best shot. I mean, I don't want to suggest that anyone who was involved in adapting the books to make those films was not putting a lot of work in and using all their gifts, but the source material resists such adaptation.
They even complain themselves that they had to take some liberties with the Voyage of the Dawn Treader because there isn't an antagonist, and you've got to have an antagonist. So they had the Green Mist. And you also see the way they kept trying to crowbar the White Witch into every single movie to make it a franchise, to make it consistent. So in Harry Potter, I haven't actually read it because I had friends that really loved it, and so I actually went, no. But
I just got an insight into your psyche there, David.
It is kind of revealing. Okay. I actually remember when Jurassic Park was revealed while I was released, when I was at school, and everybody was wild about it. I didn't see it, I think, for about 8 years, for the same sort of reason. Anyway, but you saw in Walden Media that they were trying to create things that were consistent through the movies, a consistent tone, a consistent setting, consistent characters. It's like, hey kids, you remember the White Witch? Well, she's come back again and again, or maybe she's behind the Green Mist. Who knows? You see, or is this now the Lady of the Green Kirtle? They've really tried to create some continuity between the different books, and as I started saying and then got distracted. Walden Media said that they actually had to change the story because you need an antagonist. Actually, it wasn't. I don't think it was technically Walden Media, but anyway, the guys that made the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, they needed to insert an antagonist because that's what movies need. You can't just have it be a spiritual quest movie because we had an enemy in Prince Caspian, we had an enemy in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, so we need one here.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's an issue of what medium is being used to tell the story. I mean, obviously, books are about words, right? And you could have some pictures in there, but they're mainly about words, and movies are mainly about pictures. And the very word cinema means movement, And so cinema lends itself to spectacle and movement and that kind of depiction of drama, whereas books naturally don't do that. Now, some books do adapt really well because they are action adventure thrillers, and there's escapes on every page. The Narnia books aren't like that. The misstep, I think, was in trying to fit the Narnia Chronicles into the action adventure genre when they are not action adventure books. They actually there's a lot of episodes of daring do, possibly, or there are fights, or there are interpersonal conflict, and there might be vistas you can show, which would be good to see. But it doesn't work in the same way as Middle Earth, in terms of what the sort of those Peter Jackson films were doing. But yeah, I mean, we're back into the when did these films come out? 2008 or something? I mean, it's sort of,
it was a while ago.
We're right on the pulse here, David. We are really.
But I have a suspicion that you're old enough to remember the BBC versions. Did you ever watch those? Yeah, I saw those on TV when they first came out. I invited my friends over. And I still honestly think those pretty much stand up. Unlike the Beavers, who apparently kept falling over, and there was somebody dedicated on set to picking them back up again.
It's an important role. No, I do think those worked, and they had a sort of Sunday evening charm to them, didn't they? I mean, that was a sort of, they were very small. They were English, right? There was a very kind of just a lack of vaulting ambition to create something, for a guy who was absolutely taken with northernness, right? For Lewis to be kind of really into his Norse myths and things, there isn't much northernness in the Chronicles of Narnia. They are quite tame. I mean, he's writing children's literature clearly, but all right, he's not a tame lion, okay?
I was waiting for it.
I know, I saw you itching to throw that one in. But there is, in relation to some of the other sorts of literature, even for children that's been put out there, there is a lot less sort of high peril. They're not operating using those sorts of techniques. And I think if Lewis wanted to, he could have done it another way.
And you see that in the way that the various adaptations have changed things. So in the movie versions, the battles are greatly expanded. When I reread Narnia as an adult, I was shocked to see that the battle in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is about a page.
Yeah.
But then in the movie, it's a substantial portion of time. And it's interesting what you say there about peril, because one of the things that you mentioned in your video, and I think it's very true, are the parenthetical insertions of Lewis into the story. That he, particularly after anything scary has happened, he will often come in with some avuncular comment to explain it's a bit like this, or don't worry, they were okay. And that doesn't suit the genre of where you're trying to ratchet up the tension all the time. You also have to cut those out. And I really like those asides. It's like Uncle Jack is talking to me, as I'm reading a story.
And exactly, as I also mentioned on the video, Neil Gaiman talks about the sort of the magic of these parenthetical asides, and how do you do that as an author? How do you make that connection between you and the reader? And as you say, right, how do you make the connection between you and the author, the reader, and the one listening? And I think that's a dynamic which is very precious, and yet a lot of the time we overlook it because we just it's either me and my book, or it's me and in the movies. The idea that I'm actually involved in quite an intimate relationship with the person who's reading this book to me. And as I say, I've got the Lewis privilege, man. So that was my childhood.
Well, I think you make some compelling arguments here. But
Mm-hmm.
Netflix does have the rights to Narnia. They spend an awful lot of money on them, and I
Yep.
can't see them abandoning it entirely. So they're
Yep.
probably going to do something at some point. So let's say that
Mm-hmm.
Netflix have come to you. They want you to be a
Mm-hmm.
creative consultant. They're going to offer you ridiculous
Yep.
amounts of money. You turn it down as a matter of principle, and then they tell you that they have your family hostage and you have to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
What advice would you give? What directions would you give if you were trying to
Mm-hmm.
turn the Narnian books into a franchise? What would you change? What would you
Mm-hmm.
add? What would you take away?
Um, I think so. I would make the point that these are not like get the genre right on this thing. Don't make something and don't try and sell your audience something which is posing as action adventure.
Mm,
Um, what if you approach this from I don't know, a sort of from an animated point of view? You know, you could think
mm.
if you think about the films of Studio Ghibli, however you sort of say that. Um, I'm not saying hand the reins of the project to Miyazaki, but to say there is something charming about the way in which these stories are being told visually,
Mm,
and it's actually quite a relaxing watch, and yet they manage to show real character. There's lots of fantastical elements to those things. There is awe, there is wonder, there is delight, there is emotional resonance and depth. And you haven't got crazy battle scenes happening all the time. So what learn from that sort of a genre. Um, I think there's a charm. I mean, if you think of uh, certainly as another Brit, the Paddington movies. Now, clearly, that is a very different franchise, but it's live action using some CGI. But they've held it in with charm. There's something that feels intensely British about them, and they sort of almost operated as a kind of here's Britain re-showing itself to the world along along with the London 2012 Olympics. So it was just a sort of it wasn't trying to be something that it's not.
mm,
So don't go and film these things, in New Zealand just so that you can sort of do that. Keep this. Uh, let's have a lot of distance between the camera and the background, but let's also keep that scope quite small at times as well. Um, what else would I say to them? Netflix. I think I would say let's go with a narrator.
mm.
Let's include I think they did that with a series of unfortunate events.
They did.
The
Lemony
movie
Snicket.
for that.
And
Yeah, they
I had a
use.
thought that they could actually even set it up as a framing device, as
Mm,
World War II children sitting in the kilns at Lewis's feet, and he's reading them a book. You're taking some artistic license. This wasn't all done
yeah,
then, but
yeah, yeah, yeah.
that way you can have a narrator who
Mm,
is part and parcel of the
yeah,
story.
yeah, yeah. I think um, that's okay. Let Lewis's voice come through. I think
Mm.
that's what I'd be keen to do. Um, Otherwise, you're going to be forcing something that doesn't need to be there. Um, yeah. What else might I say? I'm not sure, but
I also take your
yeah,
point
we could.
about animation. I actually think that would be a good option, particularly if because there have been various wild theories about maybe there'll be some movies of some of them, TV series of say The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which is much more episodic. That would work.
Mm-hmm.
And there was also a question of what do you do about the horse and his boy? Because you got a lot of talking horses there. That would cost a fortune to animate
Yeah, yeah,
using
yeah,
CGI. But a more traditional form of animation might actually really work there, and you can also be a little
yeah,
bit more artistic with the style. It doesn't have to be quite so
yeah,
photorealistic.
yeah, and yeah, exactly as you say. The idea of older versions of animation, and you could even change them per book.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean? There is you could maintain a consistent aesthetic, I think, and actually use different media to tell the stories. Just get back to the wonder of it, really. Go back, read about Lucy's first encounter with Tumnus, and just settle with that for a little bit and try and think how you would really capture that, rather than thinking, well, we've got this, this great big franchise we need to milk until
You got to
it's
sell
dead.
lunchboxes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, for the rest of the time today, I want to ask you more generally about Lewis's approach to myth and storytelling. And probably
Mm-hmm.
a good place to start is Addison's Walk, which I actually got to visit for the first time last year. I'd actually been to Oxford before,
Okay.
but I'd never quite managed to make it. But I took my son and wife and mother around Addison's
Mm-hmm.
Walk and told them lots of Lewis facts, whether they wanted to hear them or not. So let's talk about the original Addison's Walk journey between Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of Lord of the Rings, and Dyson, who was another of the Inklings. For newcomers who are unfamiliar with it, what happened and what was the significance of their conversation?
Yeah. So at this stage, all three of them are working as professors in Oxford University. At this stage, Lewis is sort of has come round to some theism, some sort of from his atheism, but he's not yet a Christian. And yet, for the three of them, their main interest is literature and is in myth and storytelling. So they have dinner, and then they go out for a walk. The three of them. This is I've written the date down. The 19th of September, 1931. So in what's that? 8 years' time, we're all going to have to go back for the centenary of the Addison's Walk. I'll be there. I'll see you there. So 19th September. So yeah, it's sort of early to mid autumn in Oxford, and they're having a long chat about mythology and whether myths can be true. Lewis famously says that myths are lies, but breathed through silver, which is a lovely sort of turn of phrase, even if I disagree with the sentiment. But Tolkien, as a convinced Catholic, is not having any of this, and will sort of wants to kind of really push into this idea that Lewis is missing the point, or mything the point, if you like it. So he basically says, as they're walking sort of late into the night, and then they do Addison's Walk, and they go back into Lewis's rooms. And this is a late night conversation. I don't think Tolkien leaves till 3 a.m. and then Dyson doesn't leave till 4 a.m. or something. It's like, this is the dream, surely, right? Just sitting around talking about mythology and theology and all that stuff. And as Lewis is hearing Tolkien give a defense of the veracity of myth, or the way in which myth can reveal reality and reveal truth. Lewis reflects on that and says this was a big moment in his coming to faith. And Tolkien invested that time in him, as did Dyson, as did others as well. So in Lewis's journey to faith, which obviously he describes in Surprised by Joy, this is a very significant evening and a very significant conversation.
And there were some responses to this night. Tolkien wrote a poem, Mythopoeia, and it was a good time later, but it was focusing on this central idea. Lewis writes an essay called Myth Made Fact. Do you mind just talking about those different responses?
Yeah, so the Tolkien poem isn't as good as you'd hope, which is, so I think I'm a true fan because I'm sort of holding these guys to their better work. So Mythopoeia, effectively, Tolkien goes back to his rooms and just writes up his argument in verse. Really, is just sort of
As
saying,
everyone does. I think more apologists
yes,
should do that these days.
And so he says, just gives an account, mythopoeia, and you can sort of find that. So just for the sake of clarity, so mythos, just the word for story, and poeia, a word meaning to make. So myth making or story making could be a good description of that. And he says, look, this is what I told you last night about the power of myth and the truthfulness of myth. So that's what comes from Tolkien. As I say, it's not his best work. It's not rubbish, of course, because it's Tolkien, but it probably wasn't edited quite as much as it could have been, and it wasn't really designed to be used in anything much more, I think, than friends who write things and create things all the time as sub-creators. So that's from Tolkien's side. And then Lewis's essay, Myth Became Fact, which is in, I think, God in the Dock, and you can find copies of it online as well in PDF form, which I think is such a helpful, classically Lewis holding together of two apparently contradictory ideas. Myth and fact, we would see those as opposites, and yet Lewis says, no, because of the nature of humanity, because we are mythopathic, right? We are receptive to story, as he says. Therefore, the Christian message is both perfect myth and perfect fact. It doesn't cease to be myth because it really happened. And so he says, wonderful line. It's the myth that gives life, which I just think is a really great phrase that doesn't get enough, sort of airing. The myth gives life. So myth became fact, and it's got some other great bits in there. He says, as myth transcends thought, incarnation transcends myth. The heart of Christianity is a myth, which is also a fact. And so he's looking at different ideas of, surely we've got to reject the idea that Jesus rose from the dead because Balder rose from the dead in the myth of Balder, or Osiris rose from the dead in the myth of Osiris. Lewis says, no, this really happened under Pontius Pilate. At a definitive point in human history, a tomb was empty, and you expect, because that's the way reality runs, to find mythic resonance with other stories that people have told.
Yeah, it's actually something you see in the Church Fathers when they look at what preceded the gospel in the lands where it took root, not only in Israel, but also in the Greek-speaking lands. And many of them compare the preparation for the gospel in Israel through the prophets with the preparation for the gospel in the Greek-speaking lands through both Greek philosophy, but also these myths that are basically preparing hearts and also showing what our hearts are desiring, that there's something built into us that is wanting this. And here's the good news. It actually happened at a particular place in history at a particular time.
Yeah. And it's interesting. So again, Lewis talks about it in Reflections on the Psalms. So he's got a great chapter there on second meanings and how people can say things which take on greater significance in light of later events. He has a wonderful thing where he's talking about the resonances or the similarities or between what you find in Plato. He says there's a real connection between what Plato and the myth makers most deeply were and meant, and what I believe to be the truth. I know that connection, and they do not, but it is really there. I mean, apart from just enjoying the fact that he says Plato and the myth makers, like there's some sort of 60s rock and roll band. Hello, we are Plato and the myth makers. But he's saying that, as you say, there is a preparation for the gospel. And when those, he says, the myth makers will, see the truth, they will say, I had it. I had an inkling that might be right, and yet I was very far from it. So I do think that in terms of Lewis's view on how to deal with comparative mythology, he's very much of the view that there are truths mixed in with distortions and photo negatives and all that sort of stuff, which I think, depending on how you feel about the Tower of Babel, you can give a bit of an argument to suggest that there is a dissipation of truth, that effectively fact becomes myth as a result of that, rather, and so it spins off into other stories.
Well, this incident also really helped shape Lewis's understanding of storytelling in general. Yeah. And he writes about that in a lot of places. But I think the key essays are on stories and the beautifully wordy, sometimes fairy stories say best what's to be said.
Yeah.
Can you speak to those a little bit?
Yeah, so the on stories thing is just a fascinating one to read. I would recommend everyone sort of gets hold of a copy or rereads it if they've read it before. As you look at, interestingly, he talks about the adaptation of King Solomon's Mines from a book into a film, and talks about the replacement of one kind of jeopardy and danger for another. And, as you mentioning, this green mist in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, he sort of says, you've changed the story. And so Lewis himself would have taken issue with what's going on there. So story and storytelling, when you change things out, you really do change things. And those things should be respected in a way. There's also something else he says in terms of how does plot work? What does plot do? And when you speak to authors and writers at the moment, I think plot has a bad reputation. People don't want to be plot driven; they want to be character driven. They much prefer that. And yet Lewis says that plot, in a way, is a sort of net in which we can briefly catch an idea, and we can take a look at that bird in the net for the time of the story, and that it captures it in plot better than it does in life. And so that there is a role of story to give us a perspective or a glimpse or a longer lasting look at truth through storytelling. So that therefore it's a gift of God that we have stories, because it allows us to really focus in on something quite powerful. And I think one of the key points that people bring out from sometimes fairy stories may say best what's to be said, is this phrase, watchful dragons. So I've long loved that phrase and wanted to, I think someone had it as a Twitter handle, and they had never posted or something. I was infuriated because I couldn't. I was like, "Oh, you wasted this." Basically, just to say, in the essay, Lewis is talking about. In fact, it's an article that he wrote for the New York Times, I think. He says, "Why did one find it so hard to feel what one was told one ought to feel when one was told about the suffering of Christ?" He says, "The obligation to feel freezes feelings."
As every guy who's ever had a relationship talk with his girlfriend will know, as soon as you're told you have to now explain what you're feeling, it's like, I have no feelings, I have no thoughts.
I have never had any feelings. So the obligation to feel freezes feelings. But he says, what if one could strip back those stained glass and Sunday school associations and set them into a fantasy land? Could they not appear with their original potency? could one not steal past watchful dragons? So his argument there is that as human beings, we are naturally resistant to new ideas, and we don't want to confront something that might disrupt our world. So we roll up like hedgehogs with our spikes out. Lewis says, in a way, that we're like dragons, and a story is stealthy. It manages to get past your defenses. And, biblically, you see this with the prophet Nathan when he speaks to David, tells him the story of the man and his ewe lamb. There is a power to storytelling to make you feel that which you didn't want to. And so, stories may say best what's to be fairy stories may say best what's to be said, which I do take as a terrible title, but it explains what's going on in the essay. So there we go.
Yes, as we would say, it does what it says on the tin.
It certainly does.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And you started by saying that Lewis's imagination was baptized by George MacDonald's and Lewis baptized yours. I think that's true for an awful lot of people, because I've gone back and read Fantasties, and while it's a very interesting book, I do not see what Lewis got so excited about at all. Then change the subject to the Chronicles of Narnia, and then I exactly know what he means.
Yeah. No, it's very true that those stories, and I think partly because they shaped us. I mean, I don't know how old you were when you first had them, read them.
1 year old, 2 years old, 3 years old. I have no idea.
Yeah. So they become part of your, emotional sort of architecture in a way, I think, and that's what great stories do. And when you're, in the hands of a great storyteller, who understands where the stories come from, I think that can be a very good experience.
And it's something that Lewis does again and again in his work. At the moment, we're going through Out of the Silent Planet, and I hadn't read it many times before. I think I read it maybe twice before we started this season, but I'm now seeing all exactly the same sets of things. And this was actually the inciting event for Watchful Dragons, because out of all of the reviews of the book, only 2 people realized that he was actually doing something a little bit clever with philosophy and theology, who Maleldil actually is. And giving us a vision of what a perhaps unfallen world. We haven't completely answered that question so far as to where we've got to, but what an unfallen world might look like, but more importantly, to basically see the difference of our fallenness, the baggage that we bring to everything.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Nate Morgan Locke, thank you for coming on the show.
Well, thank you very much.
I hear the landlord ringing the bell for final drinks. So would you mind just telling people where they can go to find out more about you, watch more of your videos, and anything else you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, so you can find me on all the socials, Nate Morgan Locke. But YouTube is where we put out quite a lot of content for Speak Life. So if you search Speak Life UK on YouTube, you'll find lots of those videos. And we've just reorganized a little bit of how we're doing stuff. So I now have a dedicated channel, which I'll be continuing to add content to, called Reformed Mythologist. So you can look for Reformed Mythologist on YouTube, and we're doing stuff there with movies, mythology, the Messiah, music videos, all sorts of different stuff will be on there. But that's where you can find the franchise storytelling series if you want to find out more.
Wonderful stuff. Well, viewers, listeners, please join us again next time when we'll be going further up
and further in.
Cheers.
Cheers.